Flight attendant tells a young black girl to move for a white woman, not realizing she owns the entire airline. The moment 17-year-old Arielle Morgan stepped onto Flight 178 from Atlanta to Zurich, dressed in a grey hoodie and worn-in sneakers, she looked like any other teenager heading off on her first solo adventure. To the crew and the other passengers, she was just a girl with a backpack and big dreams, not someone meant for Seat 1A in first class. But this wasn't just any trip. It was a graduation gift from her father, a quiet billionaire and founder of MorganAir, who had more in mind than a luxurious flight. He had quietly placed her as acting executive chair, testing not only her readiness to lead, but also his airline's commitment to treating every passenger with dignity. So when a polished flight attendant insisted Arielle vacate her seat for a familiar-looking white woman deemed more fitting, no one imagined that this modest, soft-spoken teen was actually running the show. And by the time the plane touched down, they'd all realized just how badly they had misjudged her. Arielle Morgan, 17, stepped onto the aircraft with a quiet confidence that often went unnoticed. She was soft-spoken, observant and wise beyond her years, traits inherited from her father, Thomas Morgan, the elusive billionaire behind MorganAir. Though she had grown up around luxury jets and shareholder meetings, Arielle preferred hoodies over heels, blending in rather than standing out. This flight from Atlanta to Zurich wasn't just a celebration of her acceptance into an elite international business program. It was a silent trial her father had designed, placing her in the position of acting executive chair, unbeknownst to the flight crew. Thomas Morgan, watching the flight via secure live feed from corporate headquarters, had one goal: to see how his staff treated someone they assumed didn't matter. Arielle took her seat in 1A, the plush window seat that had always been her favorite since childhood, and offered a polite smile to the crew. But Clara Winslow, the lead flight attendant, gave her only a fleeting glance before moving on. Clara was sharp, polished, and ran first class like her own private lounge. But her pride often clouded her judgment. She had worked for MorganAir for nearly a decade and had grown accustomed to catering to the Dana Whitmores of the world. Wealthy, well-dressed, and accustomed to being treated like royalty. Dana, an elegant socialite in her late 40s, with pearls at her neck and designer luggage in tow, boarded moments after Arielle and immediately noticed her sitting in the front row. Clara approached Dana with a warm greeting, offering champagne and addressing her by name. Clearly she was a regular. But when Dana's eyes landed on Arielle in seat 1A, her brows furrowed. She leaned in, whispering something under her breath to Clara, who nodded almost reflexively. It was the unspoken exchange that so often precedes exclusion. A look of confusion, a moment of judgment, and then action. Clara returned to Arielle's row, her demeanor now formal but strained. "Miss," she said with a tight smile, "I believe there's been a mix-up with your seating assignment. This seat is reserved for one of our elite members." Arielle blinked, taken aback, but calmly presented her boarding pass. Clara barely glanced at it. Behind her, Dana adjusted her silk scarf and offered a knowing smirk. To them, Arielle didn't look like a CEO's daughter or someone worthy of that seat. She looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong part of the plane. Arielle sat quietly, trying not to draw attention, but the humiliation began to creep in. She had been taught to lead with grace, even under pressure. Meanwhile, Thomas Morgan narrowed his eyes at the feed, watching the exchange with growing disappointment. He had hoped the team he built would be better than this. But as Clara insisted Arielle move to the back of the plane and Dana prepared to slide into the now empty seat, none of them knew the truth. The girl they just pushed aside was not just a passenger. She was their future boss, and this flight would become a lesson the entire airline industry would never forget. Clara stood in the aisle of first class with her arms folded, her polished expression masking the underlying assumption that Arielle didn't belong. Passengers nearby began to glance up from their devices and glasses of wine, sensing the tension. "I'm sorry, but there's been a seating error," Clara said in a tone loud enough for others to hear. "This seat is reserved for one of our longtime elite members. I'll have to ask you to move to a seat in the back." Arielle's heart thudded in her chest, but her face remained composed. She pulled out her boarding pass from her hoodie pocket and handed it over, her voice measured. "This says 1A." Clara barely glanced at it. Behind her, Dana let out a soft scoff, tilting her designer sunglasses up to get a better look at the girl who, in her mind, clearly didn't meet the unspoken standards of first-class passengers. "There must have been a system glitch," Clara continued, already motioning for Arielle to gather her things. With a quiet nod, Arielle picked up her backpack and book, sliding out of the seat she had once proudly taken. As she walked the aisle toward economy, whispers followed her, subtle, coded, and judgmental. The stares of passengers burned hotter than the Georgia sun. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others pretended not to notice. Not one person spoke up. In row 29B, just a few seats away from the restroom and surrounded by the faint scent of disinfectant, Arielle settled into the middle seat between two strangers. She stared blankly at the tray table in front of her before pulling out her phone. Her thumbs moved quickly. "They moved me to the back. I stayed calm, just letting you know." The message was short, direct, and sent to the one person who needed to see it: her father. Back at MorganAir headquarters, Thomas Morgan read the message and leaned back in his leather chair, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just a disappointing employee error, it was proof that the very bias he had long feared was still embedded in his company's culture. What Clara didn't know was that this flight had been flagged weeks ago as part of a confidential internal audit, an integrity test ordered by the board to evaluate staff behavior under pressure. And Arielle, she wasn't just a random passenger, she had been handpicked to play a pivotal role as co-chair of MorganAir's Diversity and Inclusion Council, a new initiative created to evaluate real-world treatment of passengers across all classes. Her notes, behavior, and experience on this flight would directly influence hiring, training, and leadership decisions moving forward, including Clara's future with the airline. The irony was stark. In dismissing Arielle, Clara had unknowingly dismissed the very person whose report could decide her promotion or her termination. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain was quietly alerted by HQ to a situation developing in Cabin 1. No names were shared, just a firm directive: closely monitor the flight. You'll be briefed in due time. What had started as a routine trip across the Atlantic was beginning to feel like the prelude to something much larger. And for Clara, her polished confidence would soon begin to crack. At cruising altitude, Captain Joel Ramirez sat in the dim glow of the cockpit's instruments, sipping his coffee and reviewing the flight logs when a secure message blinked across his screen. It was brief but urgent, bearing the MorganAir executive tag: "Passenger in 1A removed without cause. Immediate correction required. Her name is Arielle Morgan." The captain nearly dropped his cup. Arielle Morgan, he knew that name. Everyone in the company did. She was the daughter of Thomas Morgan, the founder himself, and more recently had been quietly announced as the acting executive chair during board restructuring. This wasn't just a minor issue, it was a full-blown disaster waiting to happen. He pressed the intercom and called for Clara Winslow to report to the cockpit immediately. When Clara arrived moments later, expecting a routine service note, the sight of Captain Ramirez's stern expression wiped the pleasant facade from her face. He didn't waste time. "You removed a passenger from 1A, he said evenly. "That passenger is the owner's daughter, and this flight is under internal review." Clara stood frozen, mouth slightly open, the color draining from her face as the weight of the mistake began to hit her. Meanwhile, back in economy, Arielle sat with her headphones in, but no music playing. She watched quietly as a few rows ahead, a teenager turned to her seatmate with a phone in hand, whispering excitedly. The screen showed a social media post, just a screenshot of a flight manifest with the caption, "Mysterious MorganAir Air rumored to be on board Flight 178 to Zurich." It had only taken one employee on the ground to recognize the name and start a ripple online. The whispers grew. A businessman across the aisle tilted his laptop to read better. A flight attendant passing by paused mid-stride to glance at the headline before quickly averting her eyes. Arielle didn't respond. She simply kept her posture composed and her expression unreadable. She had grown up learning that silence often revealed more than outrage ever could. The discomfort in the air was now tangible. People were beginning to realize that the quiet girl in the hoodie they dismissed might just be the most powerful person on the plane. At the front of the aircraft, Clara stumbled back down the aisle after her meeting with the captain, her polished steps now faltering. Her confident demeanor had cracked, replaced by the distant glaze of someone bracing for the fallout. She headed straight to the galley, avoiding eye contact with passengers, especially Dana, who sat smugly in 1A, still oblivious to the storm brewing around her. The energy in the cabin was shifting rapidly. Ariel remained still, watching the clouds drift by through the tiny window beside her seat, knowing that the moment of truth was approaching. And this time, it wouldn't come with yelling or confrontation, but with a quiet reckoning that would echo far beyond the walls of this plane. Clara stood at the edge of economy class, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if they might stop the shaking. Her face was pale, her perfect posture now betrayed by a rigid nervousness. With every step she took toward row 29B, the murmurs among passengers grew louder, some craning their necks, others pretending to stay glued to their screens while sneaking glances. Reaching Ariel, Clara forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes and bent slightly at the waist, her voice low but still audible to those nearby. "Miss Morgan," she said carefully, "there appears to have been a mistake with your seat. We'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class." Ariel met her gaze, saying nothing at first, her expression calm but unreadable. Then slowly she stood. Without a word, she slung her backpack over one shoulder and walked past Clara, her steps measured and unhurried. The aisle fell into a hush as passengers leaned back to clear a path, every eye trained on her. There was no announcement, no spectacle, yet somehow it felt like the cabin had entered a different kind of airspace. Dana, lounging in 1A with a blanket over her lap and a champagne flute still in hand, turned just as Ariel reached her row. Her smirk vanished when she saw who was approaching. But before Ariel could sit, a man near the front of the cabin rose. He wore a dark blazer with a subtle lapel pin that marked him as a sky marshal. Or so everyone had thought. He cleared his throat and addressed the cabin in a firm, even tone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this flight has been part of a scheduled but confidential MorganAir quality assurance review, conducted to assess staff performance and passenger treatment across all classes." He paused as gasps rippled through the cabin. "Miss Arielle Morgan, who was wrongly removed from her seat earlier, is not only a valued passenger, she is the acting executive chair of this airline." A stunned silence fell over the cabin. Dana visibly recoiled, her face losing all color. Clara, still standing beside Ariel, blinked rapidly, then attempted to speak. Miss Morgan, I deeply apologize for what happened earlier. I didn't realize..." But her words trailed off under the weight of the moment. Ariel simply nodded and stepped back into her seat, placing her bag beneath the footwell and unfolding her blanket as if nothing had happened. She didn't need to say anything, the shift in atmosphere said it all. Whispers turned to awkward silence, then to quiet respect. Passengers who had watched in silence earlier now looked visibly uneasy, stealing glances at the teenager they had underestimated. Dana crossed her arms tightly, shrinking into her seat, while Clara stood frozen, absorbing the sting of her mistake in front of everyone. The damage had been done, and the lesson was only beginning to unfold. As the wheels of Flight 178 touched down on the Zurich runway, a collective hush settled over the cabin. The usual clamor of passengers reaching for bags and chatting about connecting flights was replaced by a palpable awareness that this arrival was different. Through the oval windows, a small delegation of MorganAir executives stood at the gate, flanked by 2 members of the local press and a discreet security detail. The moment the aircraft came to a complete stop, a flight attendant, one who had stayed respectfully silent throughout the ordeal, approached Ariel and softly said, "They're ready for you." Ariel stood with quiet poise, slinging her backpack over one shoulder and adjusting her hoodie, her expression composed and steady. As she walked up the aisle, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some murmuring apologies under their breath, others simply nodding in solemn acknowledgement. Near the front, Dana stood abruptly, her designer bag in one hand, her sunglasses pushed up like a shield. "Miss Morgan," she began, her voice unsure, "I just want to say, I didn't know, and I truly am sorry if..." But Ariel stopped her with a gentle, unwavering gaze. "Some lessons," she said softly but clearly, "are better learned in silence." The words hung in the air like a curtain being drawn, and without waiting for a reply, Ariel turned and exited the aircraft. At the jet bridge, cameras flashed quietly, just enough to capture her face, but not enough to overwhelm her. She was greeted with nods of respect, not fanfare. Behind her, Clara was intercepted by two members of MorganAir's compliance division. One leaned in and murmured, "Ms. Winslow, you'll need to come with us for a debrief." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but quickly closed it, knowing there was little she could say to reverse what had already been written into the day's events. As she was led quietly toward a different exit, heads turned to watch her go. The same heads that had turned away earlier when Ariel was wronged. Back in the terminal, a soft round of applause broke out. It wasn't thunderous, but it was heartfelt, an offering of acknowledgement and respect for a girl who had been judged, dismissed, and had risen above it all with grace. Ariel didn't look back. She walked toward the executive lounge where a private car awaited, her head high, her presence calm and composed. She hadn't shouted, hadn't demanded, hadn't made a scene. And yet her presence had shifted the tone of the entire journey. That was the power her father had hoped to see. Not dominance, but quiet strength. She had passed the test, not just as an executive, but as a leader in the making. And as Zurich's soft grey skies opened up above her, it was clear to everyone, especially those who had doubted her, that this young woman didn't just belong in first class. She owned it. Ariel never raised her voice. She didn't argue, plead, or try to prove her worth to anyone. From the moment she was asked to leave her seat until the moment she returned to it, she carried herself with quiet dignity, allowing others to reveal their true character while she simply remained true to hers. She didn't need to wear designer clothes or drop her last name to command respect. Because real strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek applause. It simply stands tall, waits patiently, and lets the truth rise to the surface on its own. By the time the flight landed and her identity was confirmed, those who had judged her based on her appearance were left not only embarrassed, but introspective. Clara's polished professionalism had unraveled the moment she mistook power for presentation. Dana's entitlement had crumbled in the presence of someone whose influence was rooted not in wealth, but in quiet resolve. Ariel's grace had shifted the tone of the entire plane, not through force, but through presence. And in that stillness, a message was delivered louder than any confrontation ever could. In today's world, where assumptions are often made in a split second based on race, age, attire, or demeanor, Ariel's story reminds us that appearances are deceiving and dangerous when they lead to prejudice. The lesson is simple but profound. Respect should not be conditional. It should not require proof of wealth, titles, or external validation. Whether someone is dressed in a hoodie or a tailored suit, they deserve the benefit of fairness and dignity. True leadership does not always walk in with a badge or a booming voice. Sometimes it enters quietly, observes, and teaches through example. Ariel showed that restraint is not weakness, that silence can be powerful, and that holding your ground with grace often creates more impact than shouting ever could. In a society so often obsessed with surface-level cues, her composure was a radical act. And while Clara's mistake may have cost her more than just embarrassment, it opened the door for a conversation the airline, and many watching, could no longer avoid. If we want workplaces, public spaces, and industries to grow, we must commit to looking beyond assumptions. We must teach accountability, not just through policy, but through stories like this one, where someone wronged chose not revenge, but integrity. Ariel didn't just claim her seat, she redefined what it means to belong. As the passengers disembarked, one quietly uploaded a video clip taken during the walk back to first class. The camera stayed steady on Ariel's calm stride, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her chin held high. The caption read simply, "She didn't look like she belonged in 1A," until we realized she owned the seat. Within hours, the clip had gone viral, not because it was flashy, but because it was real. And in that raw authenticity, people saw something they couldn't ignore. Not just a powerful moment, but a powerful young woman reminding the world that true respect starts with how we treat the ones we least expect. If this story moved you, reminded you of the importance of dignity, or made you rethink how we judge others, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Stories like Ariel's aren't just fiction. They reflect real struggles, silent strength, and the quiet power of choosing grace over conflict. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful, thought-provoking story. We've got more inspiring content coming your way, because sometimes the most important lessons come from the moments no one saw coming. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.